Thank you for being here. We're excited to have you with us today. 10 seasons, we've been bringing valuable conversations and insights to the table through the Your Brain at Work community. And now we're thrilled to continue evolving and experimenting bravely as we bring fresh insights, guests, and ideas to our audience. Today, we're going to be sharing a few key findings from our latest neuroleadership journal, Managing Threat Response in the Workplace. But before we get into that, a few housekeeping notes. We appreciate our Zoom participants as well as our friends streaming across our social platforms. And regardless of what platform you're on, let us know in the comments section. Speaking of comments, as we always say, please make sure if you're in Zoom to select everyone or all panelists and attendees so that we can see them. So to start, where are you guys joining in from? Share in the chat with us. New York, England, nice. Virginia, Vegas. Wonderful. All around the world as always. We are recording today's session, so if you're interested in a replay, be on the lookout for an email later today. That email is going to include a survey for feedback, as well as a number of resources that are aligned to today's conversation. We're also continuing with our Research Corner polling experience at the end, so make sure you stick around. And finally, we suggest putting your phone on Do Not Disturb, closing out of your email and messaging apps so you can really get the most out of today's discussion. And it's also going to help with your audio and video quality. And we love interaction. So again, feel free to share your thoughts and comments with us in the chat. Now, to get this show underway, I'm going to introduce our speakers for today. Our first guest is fascinated by the yet unexplored regions of understanding when it comes to our brains and the complex relationship between our behavior and neural activity. He earned his master's in neuroscience at the University of Buffalo, as well as completed his PhD in cognitive psychology at Syracuse University. Now, as a team member at NLI, his work focuses on interpreting and translating scientific research into actionable insights for organizations. He uses his expertise in cognitive psychology, specifically in human memory and decision-making, and advanced computational analysis to advise, inform, and support the creation of our scalable solutions. Please welcome Director of Impact and Measurement here at NLI, Dr. Ryan Curl. Ryan, it's great to have you here today.
Thank you, Shelby. Happy to be here.
Thanks. And our next guest for today is a researcher at the Neuroleadership Institute, where she focuses on translating cognitive and social neuroscience into actionable solutions for organizations, as well as to help communicate relevant research in an accessible manner for the public. Previously, she served as a professor at Dominican College and New York University, and as a researcher at the Nathan Klein Institute. She holds a bachelor's degree from Brown University and a PhD in neuroscience from New York University. A warm welcome to the head of scientific research at NLI, Dr. Emma Sarro. Thanks for being here today, Emma, and I will pass it over to you.
Thank you. Excited to be here. Thanks, Shelby. So I'm super excited to be here with my teammate, Ryan Curl. If anyone has watched any of the foundation sessions, we sometimes go on together and riff on science. So we'll do a lot of the same today. So today's session is all around really our new, oh, I'm so sorry, my cat is always in the way. All around our newest hot off the press paper, managing the threat response in the workplace. And it's something that applies to all of us in the workplace, even outside of the workplace. But as we'll cover our threat system, this amazing evolutionary development that we have, we can sense, rapidly respond to just about anything around us that could cause us harm. It's an amazing system, incredibly sensitive. It overrides all of their systems that we have and incredibly fast. But in the workplace, it can tend to lead to more maladaptive behaviors, maybe impact our ability to innovate, collaborate, focus. And one of our primary authors on this article, Ryan Curl, is with us today. I'm so sorry. This is really embarrassing. Is one of the top authors on the article today is with us. He's our expert, our resident expert in the threat system, and he's going to talk about, why it is the case that the threats that we sense in the workplace are just as impactful as they are maybe physical or outside the workplace. And what we can do to better manage them so that we can actually collaborate, focus, and do all of the things that we need to do in the workplace. So what's interesting about this and what leads us to really dive into the science is that in the modern world, we rarely face the physical threats so much in the corporate world. Yes, there absolutely are. We still need this system. But what's interesting about this is that the threats that we tend to respond to are social ones, are the social interactions that we're facing every single day. And what's interesting is that they tend to engage the same neural circuitry as they do for physical threats. And so in order to get us kind of started on this journey, understanding the neuroscience and how to manage them, I just want to start with a bit of like a place setting, let's say, just so we can all kind of like reference, let's say, the feelings that we get when we're in any of these social scenarios. So I'm just going to set up a scenario, and I'd love to hear the kinds of feelings that we're getting. And we all have our own subjective feelings for these threat responses, and they all tend to engage the same systems. So setting up the scenario, you come into work on Monday, you've worked all weekend, let's say, on something that you're ready to show your manager or present. The first thing you come to find out is that all of the project parameters have changed. Deadline shifted earlier. Some of the stuff that you did over the weekend isn't really relevant anymore. So you dive right in to start focusing. You have to focus all day. Within the first 30 minutes, let's say your manager comes in to tell you that the latest report that you formatted and turned in was done incorrectly. So you'll have to do it again, or she's going to give it to somebody else to do. So this is one more thing on top of what you already had focused on, only to come to find out that you might have done something wrong. And then within about 10 seconds of the door closing, your direct report comes in to say that you need to sign off on his PTO. And can you do it right now? So all of this has just kind of impacted you within maybe the first hour of work on a Monday. You're already exhausted. How do you think you'll feel? I'd love to hear many of your thoughts. And how would you feel, Ryan, to start us off?
Yeah, I mean, if you're really dealing with all that stuff, and all of a sudden your cat won't leave you alone, it's like, geez, it's the straw that broke the camel's back there.
The cat.
Just kidding. I love that the chat is loving the cat, by the way, too. Yeah, but I think for me, I mean, and I love how you you set up that situation too, where it's hard to, I think, in the workplace too, and in the in the flow of work, to like sort of compartmentalize threats in some degree. Like they end up compounding and building in your mind's eye, right? And your stress and your threat increase over time when maybe you're dealing with separate, unrelated issues. But it's hard to see it that way, I think, a lot, especially in the moment.
Yeah, right. It's hard to directly in the moment kind of change your thought process. And here's just another one. And we're getting some amazing responses here. All of them we've all felt in the workplace: anxious, overwhelmed, undervalued, even like a feeling of a pit in your stomach. That's exactly how all of us feel. And it's all relatively the same. Or one really easy one: you're pitching a new project to a group of leaders, or to a client, and your manager in the room interrupts you halfway through, tells you that you're either speaking too long or you're wrong, and proceeds to take over. So how would that instantly throw you into a state of confusion, distraction? You'd probably feel a little flushed in the face, panic.
Yeah, definitely. Panic. I love the rush of, I mean, I don't love it, but the awareness of the rush of adrenaline from Karen too. I think that's such a key factor. And it says something about, the sort of fine line between physical and social threats too. The adrenaline can be useful. We'll talk about this. I think we'll dig quite deeply into this in a bit, but the idea that one primary purpose of adrenaline is to increase our ability to engage in a physical response, right? But we can kind of harness a little bit of it to do the more day-to-day typical stuff in the workplace too. So the adrenaline balance, I think, is really important to consider as well.
Absolutely. And I think to lead into kind of what we're going to talk about today, does anyone have any strategies that they already have in place for this? Like, what do you do in the moment? It's hard unless you have something like really well built into your own, like your habit array, let's say.
Yeah, I love what Tony said too, that they would challenge the manager on the spot.
I mean, really, so what kind of environment would you have to have in place to do that? And that's maybe something we'll talk about later.
Yeah, definitely. To feel comfortable enough to do that, right? Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, so these are great. And I think really sets us up to talk about like why this happens and like what can we start thinking about doing based on the science and what we know about the underlying circuitry of like why we respond this way and what brain systems are engaged this way. I'd love to pass it on to Ryan to talk about like what is under the hood here, what's going on.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. So when we think about a threat response, especially responding to a physical threat or a social threat, I think a reasonable understanding, but maybe a bit of an oversimplification, is to think about a progression of activity from our prefrontal cortex, which is really responsible for our higher level functioning, our ability to be creative, to think critically, to kind of juggle disparate ideas in our mind, right? That's all that kind of higher level human functioning that we're capable of. But when we're starting to feel more stress, more threat, more pressure, the activity in our brain shifts from that higher level parts of our brain to this lower level, sort of evolutionarily old parts of our brain, kind of encompassed by in a term called the limbic system, which is responsible for preparing our threat response, right? So what the limbic system does in this context anyway is it pulls from, our emotional centers like our amygdala, our memorial centers like our hippocampus, and it starts to take that information, compare it to what we're experiencing in the real world, and begin to prepare a response. And there's other areas of the brain that are responsible for that, for the response side of things. But that would be a situation like, hey, what is this thing in front of me? Oh my God, that's a predator. I need to run. I need to hide. I need to fight, right? Which is quite a different level of neural processing than, I need to think critically about what's going on here. Maybe my manager has another reason for their behavior, right? These sort of more higher level complex reinterpretations, which we'll get into later, of a situation versus a fight or flight response that this sort of limbic system is preparing for when we're kind of in these high threat situations. And so I think what's important to understand too is that, it's not all or nothing. We're not all prefrontal cortex or all limbic system throughout the day in any different circumstance. We're somewhere in between most of the time, right? And maybe we can maybe we can move on from there and talk about how like we've sort of segmented that in terms of the different threat responses that we can face. So, it's not that we're always fully functioning prefrontal cortex or, ready to run out the door. We're somewhere in between a lot of the time. And what we've kind of deduced from the research and a way to sort of understand that is through threat levels. So we can talk about being under a small amount of threat, a level, we call that a level 1 threat, which is being alert, but not alarmed. And that's generally, depending on the task at hand, a useful place to be. A little bit of stress, which is really the heart. If it's adaptive, it's a strong motivational force, right? It's the reason we move forward. It's the reason we can accomplish a task. It might not be great for, creative thinking or relaxation, right? But it's good to kind of get the job done. But then we can get into these more deleterious aspects of threat, especially in the workplace, which we would call level 2 or level 3 threat, which would be highly alert and somewhat alarmed, and highly alert and highly alarmed, which they're not objectively bad places to be. It's all about whether or not our threat response is commiserate with the experience that we're facing in the world, right? If you're face to face with a predator, I hope you're in a level 3 threat, right? You need to be. That's right for the situation. But so often in the workplace, we find ourselves in these situations where our threat response is probably not finely tuned and adaptive for the situation we're actually facing. And that gets to what Emma was saying before too, that we really only have one threat response system that responds to both physical threats and social threats that we experience, let's say, in the workplace too. So it really behooves us to have techniques to manage this threat response, especially in our kind of social workplace world, so that we can kind of fine tune that to be in the most adaptive place at any given time.
Yeah. Oh, and some really great questions coming in. So Ruth, the definition of a threat, that's a great question. And it can be relatively subjective, especially in the workplace. I mean, if it's a social interaction and maybe you're not sure why your manager told you that you did something wrong, or even just being told that you did something wrong is going to trigger a sense of, being correct is a threat for us. And it actually engages those threat areas. So it is a subjective feeling I would say. Same thing with the physical threats as well. So if you see kind of a shape in the distance, if you perceive it to be, or you think it could be a bear, you're going to have that response. If you think it's just a rock, let's say, you're not going to have that threat response. So it's what you perceive to be a threat, and that will matter depending on your prior experiences too. So, this is not necessarily the topic of the conversation, but if you have had chronic situations of threats, you might be more sensitive to different kinds of triggers and more likely to fly into a level 3 threat, let's say, whereas those around you may not. So that's kind of like an interesting tangent. While you have, 100 people in a room, one situation might occur and only about half of the people might respond to that threat, and others might not see it as a threat. So that's something really important to keep in mind.
Yeah, exactly. And it's more, I think people would agree more generally in the physical realm of threats, right? And the way that they elucidated these different threat responses and the shift in activity, in neural activity as threat approaches, is through manipulating the severity, the perceived severity and proximity of a threat.
Mm-hmm.
And they literally did that. So the way I can kind of go into how the sort of typical experiment they use to uncover our threat response. Basically, they'll put your hand in a chamber and you can't see into it, but they'll tell you that they're filming inside of that chamber, and you get to watch on a screen what's going on. And what they're showing you on that screen makes you believe that a spider is either kind of far away from you or getting closer to your hand, even though there's not actually a spider in the chamber, but they've convinced you to believe that. And what they've shown is they on the screen they show the spider coming closer and closer to your hand, and then they're monitoring your neural activity as it gets closer. So in the physical world, it's very clear, okay, this is a threat, and my response should increase in severity as the threat gets closer. But if we take that, and I think to Emma's point, to the social world, right, there's far more subjectivity there, right? We can use those same analogous components that, if someone rolled their eyes at me or insulted me, I could perceive that as a severe threat. And to the degree to which it will impact my life might be how close it is to me in proximity to some degree, right? So it's those same underlying components, but they're far more open to interpretation in the social world than they are in the physical world, right? So anyway, okay, that's my tangent too. You got one, I got one too.
No, it's so true. And we could go on. There's so many great questions in here, go on for so long talking about the different variables in this, the different factors. So, and I think with all of this, I think it's really important to, before even going into how you manage yourself and how you maybe set up an environment to manage your organization like this, and setting up for a good environment for less threat-inducing responses, let's say, is that everyone is coming to the table with a different set of experiences and a different perception of what's going on around them. So that's kind of an important prior thought process to have going in. But I think what everyone is kind of thinking about now is, given what we know about the neural circuitry of the threat response, how can we develop strategies or tactics that we can build into our everyday to take on when we feel these threats coming on? So when we feel a slight distraction, maybe a level 1 threat, how can we manage that? Or when we feel we're instantly, there's adrenaline, we feel hot in the face, and we're frozen, essentially, we can't speak. What are the tactics that we can take on? So it's important first to understand how to label those, to feel I feel maybe I'm in a level 2 threat. This feels it's close, but not right on top of me, kind of thing. What are the strategies that I can do? So this is where it comes into this idea, and we'll talk about different strategies, but one of them is developing, let's say, a shared understood language across all of us. But let's talk about how would you break up these strategies, Ryan, going through the 3 levels of threat?
Yeah, so I think one thing to consider is to understand the tools in your emotional regulation toolbox to some degree, and then to start understanding what situation should prompt you to use those appropriately. And I think partly too, it's great to use them in the moment. I'm already, at an exceedingly high threat level. I need to bring myself back down. And there's definitely techniques for that. But it's also worthwhile to kind of think about this preemptively. And I think one of the key, and regardless of preemptive or not, the really gold standard in emotional regulation is this kind of reframing and reappraisal approach, which is basically to to kind of think about alternative, or let's say adaptive ways to interpret our circumstances, the situations that we're faced with. And I remember seeing a comment in the chat about, like, what a threat is. It's irrelevant. It's in the eye of the beholder, right? To some degree, right? To the degree to which I'm threatened by something is on me and based on my experiences. And so I think for us, like, that's clearly true, and we can take some control over what interpretation we choose to run with, right? That we choose to take on. And that's really what reappraisal is, right? And it's an incredibly powerful approach. And we can even imagine, I can have like 2 or 3 different interpretations of events, and I can go through, what would it be like to really follow through with this interpretation versus another? How are my emotions changing as I'm feeling this sort of thing, right? And so I think for, what we're saying for at a level 1 threat where, arguably that's an adaptive response to most workplace tasks. We have a bit of motivation, we have a little bit of stress. Maybe there's a deadline coming up, there's a bit of pressure, but we're in that kind of sweet spot of getting done what we need to get done. That might be a situation where at that point we're exposed to that, that next level of issue that comes up, like Emma talked about in those scenarios, right? This is when, some other problem comes up that you're trying to deal with while you're, focusing on the task at hand. And so this would be a situation where even if we're not put into, like, let's say a level 2 threat because of that added stress, it might behoove us to reappraise that situation so that we don't get there, right? So it's sort of a preemptive approach in terms of, hey, I need to be interpreting my world in a way that's realistic, that's accurate, and that's, I think, arguably most importantly, that's adaptive, right? That'll put me in the best spot to move forward and really bring my best self. So that kind of encompasses the entirety of reappraisal.
Yeah. Yeah. What's interesting is sometimes, we talk about, and if anyone has listened to a lot of our podcasts and read a lot of our work, we do talk about level 1 threat. Sometimes it's something that it is distracting, but what if we can use it as kind of like the sweet spot for focus? I mean, sometimes a level 1 threat is where we kind of want to be if we have a deadline. We want to be alert, but focused at that job at hand. Anything could come and distract us further and, maybe throw us into a level 2 threat. But I think if we can, as Ryan is saying, reappraise that feeling to, okay, this is going to help me focus. This is a challenge. This is what I need to pay attention to this task and hit that deadline. Then it can be almost like a good thing, unless you're going into a brainstorming session where you need to be creative, let's say, or just like relax with friends. You might not want to be at a level 1 threat. So some threat, right, Donna, some threat might be useful if you maybe reframe it as a challenge, let's say.
Yeah, I think that's right. And speaking of creativity, it's worth kind of balancing realistic reappraisals and also kind of using creativity to fuel a realistic reappraisal. Because what they've shown from the research is that the most productive, adaptive, ultimately the best like reappraisers are those that do it in a creative way, not preposterously, right? Because we don't want to go into the realm of unreasonable interpretations of our world, but we want to have access to like a complex array of possible interpretations of our situation, right? And then we can choose the one that is sensible and will, like I said, kind of help you to bring your best self.
Yeah. And a question earlier by Ruth was talking about learning emotional regulation throughout life. I think what we're talking about here are different strategies that do take time to learn and develop and become natural. So if you're learning these different strategies throughout life, it might be easier to pick up one or the other.
It was absolutely, and the best way to learn, and this is well supported in the research too, to learn how to reappraise is to do it, is to try. And that starts with, we kind of end up giving, such similar advice, but it's the same one that comes up in the reappraisal literature, is that the 2 things that you need to grow in your ability to reappraise is the belief that you can grow in your ability to reappraise, and then the opportunity to try. Those are the key things to learn, and that's reappraisal is no different.
No, that's a great question by Barbara. Is it important how to phrase this reappraisal? Say it out loud, write it down. What do you know based on the literature?
That's such a great point. So saying it out, it depends, I think, in terms of saying it out loud, because we might be getting into the realm of labeling, which we're going to talk about next. Like, if you're reappraising the situation versus playing around with different emotions that might be elicited, and you're saying those emotions out loud, that has a crystallizing effect, which we'll talk about a lot, and we'll get into that next. So so there's so much that we're going to get into next that's coming into. So one of the benefits of saying it out loud is to and we'll talk, like I said, we'll talk about this later, is to utilize like a collective to do a social reappraisal, right? Reappraise together, reappraise as a team, as a family, if that's appropriate, right? If that's an appropriate situation, but to use like, and once again, this is what we talk about in terms of in the context of learning too, is that we learn so much from the insights of others. The same thing is true for reappraisal. You can benefit so much from the reappraisal that someone else comes up with, right? As long as you're, or that you come up with together, if you're doing that collaboratively too. So in that sense, certainly being vocal about your reappraisal can have huge benefits if you're kind of doing it as a team.
Yeah. And one last thing before we go on, it's and kind of important to remember, this is a great strategy to use when you still have, I guess, the way we like to talk about the resources still within kind of your prefrontal cortex. It does take a bit of cognitive control to kind of think of the reappraisal. What is the reframe? Like, what is the reason that I'm feeling this way? Once we get to higher levels of like felt threat, it becomes harder to do that. And so that's why the strategies tend to change as we start kind of like losing our resources in an area that allows us to be flexible with our thought process and have that creativity that slowly starts to lose, let's say.
I love what Liz said in the chat here too about kind of gamifying reappraisal, that like, test yourself, how many different ways can I look at a situation. That's awesome. That's such a perfect way to build that like reappraisal muscle too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it is kind of a muscle. It does take time to build up. And that's why these strategies can be practiced, before you necessarily are thrown into a threatful situation.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. All right. So we're moving on to level 2 threat. Let's say the deadline shifts and then you're told that you did something wrong. You've kind of just like shot up a little bit. Now you're less focused. You're really distracted. You're not sure, should you snap at someone or what you should do? You can't even focus on the task at hand. So what's going on and what kind of strategy can we use?
Yeah. So in this case, I think it's important to, like I said, kind of understand the entirety of the emotional regulation tools you have in your toolbox. And another one to consider when maybe, you're just too stressed, too frustrated, whatever it may be, to give to really go down the reappraisal pathway. I would still try. I think reappraisal, as we know from the literature, it's really the gold standard in many ways. So I would give that a shot. But if it's just you're just failing in that way, one really great and really sort of the number 2 emotional regulation approach and can be kind of used with reappraisal is labeling, right? So this is to label your emotion, to put words to your emotion. And you'll find, and you can even see this sort of, I think you could sort of feel this too, that you get a calming effect through the clarity of putting a word to your emotion. Because oftentimes, like when we're feeling strong emotion, but we don't verbally identify them, where that emotion is compounded with like the uncertainty within that emotion. Like I'm just feeling like rage, right? Something like really strong. Even that I put a word to it, but you could kind of imagine that feeling versus like a more nuanced emotion that's directly aligned with the situation that I'm facing, right? So you get sort of a calming effect through that clarity through a labeling technique. So I think it's really valuable too, and it's good to be able to do that in a way that can also communicate your emotions to others as well, which we'll, I believe, get into at some point.
Yeah, and actually ties really nicely into Ruth's question. So if we're not sure how to label the emotions, maybe you can label the situation. So this kind of brings us to one of our best models here, the SCARF model. So how is this kind of like a great tool to use to label situations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's useful to label situations and to like label the source of your emotion too, to some degree. But so this is our SCARF model, which really encompasses the 5 domains of kind of social threat and reward that we might face throughout our day. And I don't know how much detail to go in here, but they contain the model contains status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness, which are the ways in which we can be socially threatened or socially rewarded. So, and so for me, one of the real critical benefits of the SCARF model in terms of kind of going down the emotional regulation path is to first use it as a way to like clarify a circumstance that you're in. So like if you imagine that you're on a team and you've been delegated some task, but there's objectively just not enough information, to know exactly what to do. You can say with the team, like, this situation has a certainty issue, right? It's not that's like inherent in the situation, and having a shared language in that way gets everyone on the same page, kind of immediately using that language, right? Which is so valuable. So now you can say, you've benefited in a few ways. You haven't yet addressed your own personal emotion, which I'll get into why that's important next. And you've also aligned on like seeing the problem in the world the same way across the team. And then you can get some, and now maybe depending on threat level and whatnot, you can do a social reappraisal potentially. What do we do about it? How do we, maybe this is an opportunity for us to kind of pave our own path, right? We're not giving enough detail on how to do this task. Maybe we can fill those blanks ourselves. Maybe we want to take that approach, which would be arguably like an autonomy reward, right? That you can reappraise the situation into a reward of autonomy as opposed to a threat to certainty. But you can use that by using this language communicatively. And what's useful about that as well, thinking about labeling the situation, is that while it is really beneficial to label your own emotion, there's somewhat recent research that have put forward the possibility that there's like a crystallizing effect to labeling your own emotion. So if you do label your own emotion, the idea is that you sort of have to run with that emotion connected to whatever the situation is. And that might be good, right? That might be the exact proper emotion that's adapted for the situation. But if it's not, you're going to have a more difficult time reappraising after you've sort of crystallized that emotion to take on another emotion as elicited by that situation. So that's why I think it's really useful to clarify the situation, use a shared language to do that, maybe reappraise, and then kind of use labeling as a really valuable tool, but one where you're more confident that you're in the right realm of emotions to kind of be adaptive in that circumstance.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think, and this is going to come up later, but this is, essentially the same kind of tool we can use as leaders or managers to kind of set the environment. I mean, it's one way to communicate to others, like, this is why I'm feeling this way, or this is the situation. This answers the question of, we had a question earlier asking, like, what if you didn't intend to insult someone or to cause them to have like a threat response? It's maybe not intentional, but now you're clear why this person was feeling threatened. There wasn't clarity or certainty around the task, and so they felt like a huge sense of ambiguity, which is threatening. Or like, you were just trying to be constructive in your criticism, but you didn't realize that actually like impacted their level of status or their sense of value to the team. So just giving that little bit of information, you as, let's say, a leader or manager, can change the way you're communicating or try to kind of fix that after the fact.
Yeah. Such a great point, because like we said earlier, there's different valid ways to interpret the same situation. So it's a great way to understand the perspective of someone else if they can communicate with this clear language. I think that's a great point. Really valuable.
Yeah. All right. So now we're thrown into a level 3 threat. You can't even focus on remembering the letters of the SCARF model to even figure out what domain you've been like impacted by, probably all of them. And all you feel is adrenaline, and you just want to run from the room or just freeze. So this is sometimes, and we sometimes show this like reinforcing cycle. This is something that can happen, and why it's actually really important to develop strategies when you're in this like very heightened sense of threat, where you're completely frozen, or you have lost the ability to make the right kinds of decisions in that situation. And it is because of the cognitive impact that stress has, that threat-inducing stress has. You're impacted cognitively so much so that you've lost a lot of self-regulation. So you can't necessarily make the right decisions in the moment. So you might snap at someone, or you might respond too quickly. And so in these kinds of situations where you can't necessarily say this was a status threat because you can't even speak, what would be the kind of strategy that you would think of, Ryan?
Yeah, and in those situations, it's also so important to understand that like that stress response, if it results in you not bringing your best self to the table, you might act in a way that increases your stress, right? And anyway, so yeah, that's this reinforcing cycle that we get that ends up getting us into level 3 and maybe keeping us there. But anyway, Donna nailed it in the chat. She calls it the walk away. And I think that's exactly right. At some point, we need to be aware that we're in such a level of threat that we just need to get away from the situation. Go for a walk. If, you're someone who likes to, go for a jog, get a workout in, if that's your style, do that. It's well established that physical motion is a really useful regulator in these sort of circumstances. So whatever your version of that is, that can be a useful approach. But yeah, removing yourself from the situation, I think ultimately is what is left in your toolbox when you're in this level of threat. And I think it's also important to think about all of these things socially too. So even that, like giving the acceptance and the encouragement that other people can do that without it being a status destroyer or anything like that. Sometimes we all get there, and it's good to be able to create an environment where it's acceptable to do that sort of thing, to leave the room, to go for a walk when necessary as well. But yeah, at that level of threat, that's what's left in our toolbox, I think.
Absolutely. And speaking of socially, you can drive others, to jump on this reinforcing cycle too. Your response to them can be the threat that drives them onto a cycle. So it can easily spiral up just as easily as it can spiral down if you walk away. But that actually kind of tees us up for kind of like our last major chapter here, which is like, how do you create the environment? We know that like a key differentiating factor that sets great leaders and managers apart is their ability to create the climate or the environment needed to kind of like reduce those like large threat inducing responses, or create an environment of psychological safety, which would be one that could allow others in your organization more easily to share how they're feeling, right? And the reason that this is the case is because we've talked about this underlying sense of threat and like the neural circuitry involved. We know that it's induced when you experience threats to you, when you actually experience them to you, both physical and social, but it's the same thing as when we observe them. So someone on your team, is spoken down to, or someone, in your organization you see in a conflict, that can impact you in the same way with the same neural circuitry. So that is, sometimes we call this a contagion effect, but it's really important to keep in mind in terms of your environment.
Yeah, absolutely. As humans, we're particularly tuned into our perception of fairness in the world, regardless of whether or not it directly impacts us. And that's one of the things that separates us from our like pre-human ancestors, is that we really have that a sense of fairness that we can detach from our own like kind of short-term experiences. Yeah, and that just says, to this greater point that, yeah, we really want to create an environment where threat is diminished, because it'll have this compounding effect, irrespective of the fact that any individual threat may or may not impact you directly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So it's important to think about them almost as like a preemptive buffer before kind of going in, and it can happen. You can use it after situations occur, but also before. And one of the tools, again, that we can talk about is how to use the SCARF model to create a sense of psychological safety. And this can be, as you're developing a team, like how do you set the rules in place? How do you create a sense of certainty for, what is everybody doing on this team? What are their roles? Like, so there's no ambiguity in why someone is there and what their role is. They feel like they have a sense of belonging. They feel that sense of relatedness. How is everyone treated on this team? There's this sense of fairness, and, am I valued? The sense of status. So, that can set up the situation, but how else can SCARF be used to create that sense of psychological safety?
Yeah, I love thinking about using SCARF. So we've talked about using it in the moment. We've talked about using it to label a situation, to label our own interpretation of a situation, right? But we can also think about using it preemptively, right? And I think that's what we're getting at through kind of SCARF buffers, right? To say like, it's not to say that we're facing a certainty threat, but it would really benefit the whole team if we have like super strong role clarity at the beginning of the creation of this team, to prevent the possibility of a strong certainty threat coming in the future. Same thing with autonomy, right? What does my team have freedom to explore? Where can we be creative? Where can we kind of courageously experiment with new possibilities and new work processes? And where can we not, right? Set those boundaries and make them really clear. Build relatedness as the team comes together, as opposed to like picking up on a lack of connection on a team and then trying to fix that, right? Which you should do if that's the case, but build that preemptively, right? So we can use SCARF to go through to also build those buffers in that'll protect us, and I think will be a critical part. It wouldn't be the entirety, in my mind, of a psychologically safe environment, but it would get you. It would be a great place to start, and a great kind of guiding light to make sure all your boxes are checked in some way.
Yeah. It's an interesting question from Barbara in the chat. She's heard this conversation. I don't mean to scarf you, but that's not necessarily the best, because what SCARF domain are you going to scarf them in?
Right. Yeah. And I think like I can feel a little anxiety just from that, like what's coming, right? So I think there's like an inherent threat regardless of what comes next, right? Yeah. So yeah, I would probably, if you're saying, I guess it depends on the situation, but for me, if you're saying, I don't mean to scarf you, but you could probably do a little bit more processing internally first and try to understand, what is the hypothetical SCARF threat that could be coming, and how can I just take that out of the scenario preemptively, as opposed to like, hey, well, it's here, it's coming, so sorry, right? Maybe there's a better approach. I could imagine a world where some situations you might not be able to come up with a better approach, and I think probably being prepared for something that could be in a SCARF threat domain might be beneficial. But yeah, I mean, I think when I'm, and I've said that, I think I've said that exact same thing before too. I don't mean to scarf you, but that probably should be a cue to think a little bit more deeply about the situation before I say something like that.
Yeah. I mean, you might know, if you know SCARF, you probably know what domain you might be hitting. So maybe instead you can reframe that sentence, not to devalue someone, or not to, add uncertainty to the situation, provide a little bit of certainty, or even just say transparently, I don't actually know the result of this or the reason that we're doing this, but, or, all of the answers, but so that you're both on the same page. Or, as we often try to, suggest when we're talking about SCARF, is if you're going to provide a lack of certainty, provide a bit of fairness too, like send a little bit of reward, like, what, we're all feeling this way, we're all in the same boat, but there aren't answers in this sense. Or, I'd really love your input here. This, can give someone a sense of value or status, while that you will be providing them, no autonomy, let's say, in a certain situation. So try to kind of balance that threat that is coming, instead of telling them it's coming, with a little bit of reward, or even acknowledge, after the fact, I understand that might have been a bit of an autonomy threat, but I'm going to give you a little bit of certainty in X and Y, for instance.
Yeah, and it'll also shed light on how you can frame a situation. I was just having a conversation the other day about sort of how to conceptualize of inclusion. And if we think about sort of, optimizing inclusion, for instance, as opposed to maximizing it, there's a situation where it might make sense to limit the number of people in a meeting for whatever purpose, right? And so like that's a framing issue, right? So it's not to say that you're excluded from that meeting because you're not valued there. It's because you're really highly valued elsewhere, right? So so you might say, hey, initially I'm just going to like erase this person from the meeting invite. Oh, that would be a status threat, pretty obviously, right? So let's use that as a trigger to reframe, to correct how I'm framing this decision to the person, right? And I think in most cases that would be an honest reframing, in the sense that, yeah, that is the reason they were excluded here, is because their time is more valuable elsewhere, and just make that super clear, right? So I think we can use SCARF to like identify those potential SCARF threat triggers and preemptively adjust the way that we navigate communication.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of it is, being transparent as possible, and setting the environment up. I mean, if we think about psychological safety, it's in setting up the team, in like making it, let's say, safe to speak up, but also when you're in the middle of a discussion. I mean, as managers and leaders, we do have to give criticism, constructive criticism, and help others improve, and to show them where they might be making errors. That's kind of all part of the process, having these hard conversations. So I think it's important to understand that when you're in that hard conversation, using SCARF is a great way to continue the conversation and continue to send as many of the SCARF rewards as you can, understanding that it is going to be a tough situation, to be told that maybe you would like them to do something in a different way, let's say, or to work on this skill that isn't quite, at the level that it's needed to be at, for instance.
Yeah, definitely. Great point.
Anyway, so as we move on, one of our latest ideas that we've been talking about, and this is an article that Ryan wrote, is an article about collective. Well, why don't you tell a story of the article?
Sure. So, this was, I thought, really captivating work, and I think oftentimes in research, it confirms a lot of what humans already know or what we already sort of do. But nonetheless, I thought it was a neat little added bit, which is what they showed, is that reappraisal is that much more beneficial if it's done socially or done collectively. And so more specifically, what they showed is that they put people in a situation where they had a bad experience in one way or another, and they had either two conditions. One, where they asked the person who experienced the bad situation to come up with their own reappraisal with the goal of minimizing kind of negative emotion, or they had a friend give that person a way to reappraise and to ask them to take that reappraisal on. They followed up, I can't remember exactly how long after, maybe a month after, and they exposed them to the same situation again, and they monitored which group had a stronger threat response after having that same experience again. And not surprisingly, what they showed is that those that took on their friend's reappraisal had a far better adaptive response to that negative situation when they were exposed to it the next time. And so the overarching point there is that, we should be utilizing our colleagues, our friends, our family for reappraisal as well. We should be doing it socially, right? We should be building these interpretations together. And the research shows that that's such a clear beneficial path. And we already know that, right? When we have a tough situation, we might reach out to our best friend at work, or I call my mom all the time, right? That's my strategy, right? Because we know that there's added benefit there. This research strongly confirms it, and I think it would really benefit us to be really explicit about how beneficial that can be in the workplace as well.
Tony, that could be what your wife is for as well.
She will give me a hard time for calling my mom too much. Yes,
yeah, but that's true. I mean, it kind of forces you to do all of the strategies that we've had. It forces you to reappraise, to label, to actually talk out why you're feeling this way, and talk the situation out. And maybe you're venting to this person well after the fact. So it also gives you a chance to kind of separate yourself physically from the situation, or have a pet. I know my cats listen to everything that I complain about, and they don't help me through it. They don't give me any advice moving forward, but they do listen and they agree with me.
And they agree with you. Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
And it's their behavior that you have to reappraise as they pop in.
Do they walk away, or do they listen? Yeah, but that's true. I mean, so if it is, in addition to all of these individual strategies that you build for yourself, are there people that you have that you can easily go to? And I'm not sure, Ryan, in this study, this was specifically with friends, or was it with unknowns?
No, these were acquaintances. They weren't great friends, but they were people who knew each other. Yeah, which I think fits nicely with a work team. I think it was sort of trying to mimic that scenario. Yeah.
And maybe an interesting thing to, if you are in a situation and you're trying to get help reappraising it, maybe talk to multiple people. I mean, we talk all the time about the importance of having diverse perspectives, in a way to solve a problem. So why not get diverse ways to reappraise a situation? Everyone has experienced different kinds of threats in the workplace. So why not, maybe find the one that works best for you?
Yeah, I think oftentimes, and we've kind of already hit this point, but as a working team, we're probably experiencing, the same situation together, right? So we can all, we can do a collective reappraisal that we all take on. It's not always about, having some third party help me interpret my events and vice versa. It could be that we're doing this together because we're all impacted in some way as well. So to make that more of a collective open process, I think can be really valuable too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and given we know that reappraisal might be a bit more difficult when you're feeling a super high level of threat, having someone who isn't in that situation, they'll be more creative. Yeah, some great questions coming in too. So this question from Courtney is interesting. Does some freedom to express strong emotion ever help mitigate a threat response?
Yeah, I think that's such a great link to psychological safety, because if you look back, and Emma, we went down this path at some point in a blog from years ago, where they talked about like the expressing negative emotion in the workplace was a taboo for so long, and it probably still is to some degree in certain workplaces. So I think, unfortunately, if the culture isn't right, expressing a strong negative emotion will hurt you in the workplace, right? Because of the sort of toxic culture that may exist, right? So I think that highlights just how important it is to have an environment where, yeah, you can express a negative emotion without fear of repercussion, because we have the acknowledgement that we're all human, and we can benefit from that. So assuming the environment is properly tuned for that, then yes, it would absolutely be a valuable thing to be able to do. But you have to do that culture work to get there too, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So, instilling an environment of psychological safety, making sure everyone feels embraces a growth mindset, because that's all part of the process of being able to fail and learn from your mistakes, because that mistakes are also those that cause us to feel a sense of threat as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So any other questions that are coming in? Any other thoughts, Ryan, as you're going through these questions?
No, I love the engagement in the chat, though.
Yeah.
I'm sure we've missed some. But yeah, if any other questions are coming up, I'd love to keep the conversation going. We have just a few minutes left here. So yeah, I'd love to hear any other thoughts that are coming up from the audience.
Yeah. And I guess another thought that comes up is, as many people here are likely managers or leaders, role modeling this kind of behavior to help. So role modeling how you're feeling and being able to share your feelings in a situation. I think that is all kind of part of the same package. So, being able to set up an environment of psychological safety, but also showing that you yourself as a manager feel uncertain, feel threatened by certain situations. I think that can set up the environment for others to try out these different scenarios.
Yeah, definitely.
That's right. Definitely.
And like Tony's comment here about telling people that you want them to tell them how their actions impact you. I think it's so valuable. I think SCARF can help with that too. I think that's such a valuable way to use SCARF. I think you can also that helps like sort of facilitate communication. Like, hey, when you do X, Y, and Z, I see that as an autonomy threat. I think that facilitates the conversation, and I think it probably diminishes the tension between the two people to have a shared language like that that you can use to sort of hash it out. So I think that's a really valuable practice, and I think SCARF can make that less of a nice to have and more of something that you can actually build into the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. And being able to do it soon after the event. I mean, as Ruth says, containing stuff does not work well. So just think about the lack of focus that you have. That will continue until it resolves. So resolve it sooner rather than later, even if it's just for your own productivity and working on your team.
Yeah, and that brings up the sort of the third emotional regulation technique that backfires pretty much across the board, which is suppression, right? Suppressing your emotions builds anxiety, it builds stress, it diminishes physical health, right? It has every possible negative outcome. And nonetheless, it's also a commonly used attempt at emotional regulation.
Absolutely. And a great question coming in the Q&A is, and I guess we can finish soon up after, but is how to maintain a healthy environment when the company is in the middle of changes, such as mergers, or as a leader, you do not have the clarity to give to your employees. So, you can use SCARF in those situations too, provide as much clarity and certainty as you can, even if it is, I don't have much more clarity other than X, Y, and Z. I can tell you this, and this, but provide the sense of fairness that you can, the sense of relatedness. I'm here if you want to talk about this, or, your input is incredibly valuable as we go through this merger, for instance. So there is a lot of uncertainty and volatility in organizations now. So these kinds of strategies could be incredibly useful.
Yeah, and it can also help you from the sort of the change management side too, right? Like if I'm sending out different communications dictating the process of change, I might think like, well, that could be perceived as a status threat if we, tell everyone that AI is going to take 40% of your jobs or something crazy like that, right? Like some of these kind of new age issues that we're dealing with, right? So we can use SCARF to kind of preemptively gauge how in this case change management could be taken negatively and work to mitigate that in advance.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one more thing, Barbara, the idea of being able to share, those domains that you're most sensitive to. So, we talk about SCARF all the time here, and, we have maybe different contexts where certain SCARF domains are more or less important to us. But if we know our coworkers may be more sensitive domains, we can work to kind of buffer those situations beforehand.
Yeah, and especially if we know what situations those tend to occur too, right? I think we often have situations where, we might not be, status might not be in our mind on a certain situation at work, but maybe it's very pressing in another, right? So if we start understanding that and being more vocal about that so that our colleagues can understand how we're seeing our workplace, I think that can be really useful as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, this is so much fun. Any other thoughts, Ryan, as we kind of pass it back over to Shelby?
No, I thought this was a blast. I'm happy I got to do this again with you, Emma, and I'm sure we'll be right back here before too long.
Yep, absolutely. So back over to you, Shelby.
Awesome. Wonderful. Thank you both for today's discussion. We appreciate your time and all that you shared today. So now before you hop off, we are going to dive into our research corner for polling time. So we want to continue partnering with our research team to gather insights from our audience. So this season, we're incorporating this new experience at the end of each episode to gather some insights from you all on the topics at hand. So right now we will launch those polls and give you a few minutes, a minute or two to answer those questions. Nice. And as we keep that poll going, we just want to thank you again for attending today. We appreciate your time and every week that you join us. It really means a lot. And some announcements for you. So Insider Exchange, this is specifically for our senior executives. If you love your Brain at Work Live, we think you'll enjoy this experience too. It's an exclusive opportunity where you can have roundtable discussions with our internal leaders to hear what's coming up on NLI's pipeline and help us craft new innovations. So if you're interested, we will share that link in the chat. Our podcast as well. If you love today's show, it will be available on our podcast, as well as a lot of other episodes that we've done over the past few years. So look for your Brain at Work wherever you listen to your podcast. And we just want to thank you one more time. We officially say farewell. So on behalf of today's team and everyone behind the scenes at NLI, we appreciate you and hope that you return next week. Make sure that you fill your poll out, and we will see you again next Friday.